We're looking at section 8.2 and we're going to learn our final method for solving a quadratic equation. We're going to look at the quadratic formula. This is simply a formula where you find A, B, and C and plug it in and it immediately computes your answers. So here's the standard form of a quadratic equation, ax squared plus bx plus c equals 0. A is the coefficient of x squared, b is the coefficient of x, and c is the constant. Those numbers will be needed for this formula. Now before we actually begin practicing using the formula, we're going to see where it came from. So the quadratic formula is found by taking the standard form and completing the square on it. So here's the proof. It pretty much uses all of the steps that you would need to complete the square. So the first step here is you're going to divide by A because you need a leading coefficient of 1. Then you need to move the constant to the other side. After that, you are going to complete the square on B over A. So you're going to take B over A, and you're going to take half of it and then square it. You are then going to add b squared over 4a squared to both sides. Step 5 is now this trinomial will factor, so you get to factor the left and find an LCD, common denominator, for the right. Remember that trinomial factors into the same expression twice. You can now take the square root of both sides not forgetting your plus or minus. You will solve for x and you will combine the two fractions for the final formula. So here, right here, is the quadratic formula. It's negative b plus or minus the square root of b squared minus 4ac all over 2a. So we're going to dive a little deeper into part of the quadratic formula. So we're going to focus on the b squared minus 4ac. That is the expression that sits underneath the square root within the formula. It is called the discriminant. And the discriminant tells us how many answers and what type of answers we will get. So this expression, b squared minus 4ac, could end up going and equaling 0, which would give us one real solution. b squared minus 4ac, when computed, could also be greater than 0, which will give us two real solutions. Real solutions are values found on our known number line. b squared minus 4ac could also be less than 0 and will give us two imaginary answers or complex answers. So right now all we're going to do is use the discriminant to determine the number and type of solutions that this equation could have. So in order to do that, you need to know that a is 5, b is negative 3, and c is 2. So then b squared minus 4ac we will plug into. So we will say negative 3 squared minus 4 times 5 times 2. So we'll get 9 minus 40, which is negative 31. Since our discriminant is less than 0, we will have two imaginary answers. Now we're going to practice solving by using the quadratic formula. So in order to use the quadratic formula, your quadratic equation must first be set to 0. So we're going to say 2k squared minus 14k plus 19 equals 0. It must be set to 0 so you can read out the correct A, B, and C values. So A is 2, B is negative 14, and C is 19. Now we simply plug in to the formula. So the variable we're solving for is k, so k equals the opposite of b, so we'll write 14 plus or minus the square root of negative 14 squared minus 4 times 2 times 19. So it's the opposite of b plus or minus b squared minus 4ac, all over 2a, or 2 times 2. Now it's pretty much calculator work. So you're going to get 14 plus or minus the square root. You're going to do all this work with your calculator. Take negative 14 and square it, multiply all of this, combine it together, and you get 44 over 4. Now you can't leave that answer because the square root of 44 needs to be simplified. So 44 can be thought of as 4 times 11, which means 4 is sitting under the square root. So we get 14 plus or minus 2 square roots of 11 over 4, because the square root of 4 is 2. Now we have to see that the top terms are factorable by 2. So we have to factor out a 2 and get 7 plus or minus square root of 11 over 4, and then 2 drops this down to 2. So our final answer in lowest terms is 7 plus or minus square root of 11 over 2. Remember, if you cannot find the plus or minus key in MathLab, there's 2 separate answers there. First is 7 plus square root of 11 over 2, and the second is 7 minus square root of 11 over 2. So now we have one more to practice to use the quadratic formula. So number 2 would start out by distributing x. So you get 3x squared plus 4x equals negative 2. To find out and read out the proper ABC, it has to be set to 0. So 3x squared plus 4x plus 2 equals 0. So your A is 3, your B is 4, and your C is 2. So now you have x equals negative 4 plus or minus the square root of 4 squared minus 4 times 3 times 2, all over 2 times a. So now you're going to do some cleanup work. So you're going to get negative 4 plus or minus the square root of negative 8 over 6. This is 4 times 2. So you can do negative 4 plus or minus 2i root 2 over 6. Remember, now we are working with the square root of a negative, so we take the negative out as an I. Remember that imaginary answers cannot share the same denominator, so now we're going to write 2 separate fractions here. So we're going to write negative 4/6 plus or minus 2i root 2 over 6. And then that needs to be reduced to negative 2/3 plus or minus I root 2 over 3. And there's your answer on that one.